read some type of children's book to a first grader. Now, what was odd was that I would be looking around the room and all of the sixth graders would be reading to the first graders, but my partnership did not work that way. The little first grader was always picking out books to read to me. I thought that was strange, so I asked my teacher about it. I said, I'm not really reading a lot of these books. Should I be reading them to the first grader? And she said, no, it's fine. You just let him read since he wants to read. I only realized later on in life that this was all a setup. I'm sure they picked out who the partners were, and the teacher realized that I could not read very well. So I was probably reading at a first grader level, and he was reading at a sixth grader level. And so they put us together. So I did not have to look very foolish reading to this first grader. Now, this program made me think that I was normal, but only after looking back at reality, I realized that I was probably one of the slow kids in the class. It was very emphasized because every week also I would walk down to what they called resource. Now, resource was something that they gave a different name for. It was special help. It was essentially because, I couldn't read and I couldn't write and I definitely could not spell. And so I had to go to this resource room, which they would work with me. Now, when you're in elementary school, fortunately, you're not bright enough to know what is happening, but I think all the other kids knew that meant that was for the dumb kids. And so the dumb kids had to go to this resource room because all the top kids, they never got to make that walk. And I always thought this was great because I was getting out of class. Like, you smart kids, you have to stay in this classroom, but I get to go and have special help or extra help. Now, through the very many years of elementary school and high school, I learned something very quickly. I learned that failure was something I was good at. Now, not everybody can say that. Some people have never learned how to fail very well. And I learned that failure was a very valuable lesson. And it's one of the most valuable lessons that any of us can learn. Now, in our churches, we have done a very poor job of teaching people how to fail. When you think you get up and you preach, you got to tell everybody on how to be a better Christian or how you can become more like Jesus Christ, which is our series for the last few weeks as we have looked at our theme this year on how to become Christ-like. Nobody ever gets up and tells you how to fail. In fact, failure is something that we hide away in church. If you fail, we almost create the mindset or the attitude that you're not welcomed here. If you are a failure, church is not a place for you. We even teach that in families. A lot of times people will have a failure in the family and all of a sudden they will question if they are accepted in the congregation. We stink at learning to fail in the church. Failure is one of those things that we have not really taught people how to do it well. And we're all going to fail, but instead of sweeping it under the rug, instead of pretending that we are above failure, we need to address it and to learn how to live through failure because it is going to happen to all of us. But in our Christian circles, it seems like we have to hide away from this idea of failure. But if you look at Jesus Christ in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 8 to 10, we see this perception of failure around us. Look what it says here in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 8 to 10. It provides a glimpse into the inner workings of God, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Now, in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him. But we see him whom for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, and bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. Now, what is happening in this text and in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 8? It highlights that what we see is different than how God sees it. Our perception of what is happening is different than the reality of what is happening. Look what it says, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Now, putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside of his control. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him. There is one mindset that we think failure is a human perspective and it is a judgment on who you are. But God looks at failure and he is working behind the scenes, that the same failure that you think is negatively reflecting on you, God is using to actually make you more Christ-like. He is using your failure. He is using his omnipotent power to be able to look at what is happening around you and to build and weave a beautiful story in your life. He can develop you and mold you through the failures in your own world. We believe that God is sowing a mystery of blessing in the end. That even though we may fail, we have faults, we fall, we trust through faith that God can work through that. God can work through your weaknesses. God can work through your mistakes. And by doing all of this, he is creating you into the image of his Son. This is like Hebrews chapter 8, verses 28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. This man here is named Gary Cohn. And Gary Cohn grew up with a lot of failure. And he talks about his dyslexia that he had. And he said because of it, he learned very quickly that he was going to be the slowest kid in most of the classrooms. But because of that, he said, I learned to manage failure and risk very well. He tells the story of when he was in his 20s and he was selling aluminum siding. And he went down to Wall Street one day and he got into this taxi with one of these bigwigs on Wall Street who just started running the options division. In the taxi, he convinces the guy that he knows a lot about options. He never knew anything about options. But he says, I've been convincing people that I was supposed to be smart for years. And so he goes in there and he talks about later in his life and he becomes very successful. He becomes the COO of Goldman Sachs. And he says, I learned how to trade options because I was understanding the principle of failure. I knew how to fail. My dyslexia gave me an advantage because instead of this mortifying fear that we have that if I make a mistake, nobody will like me, nobody will accept me, my whole world will come collapsing down. He says, I've already processed those emotions. And so when it came to trading, I was able to emotionally handle the mistakes and the failings that we had. This is why it's so important here. If you look at Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9, impressions can be wrong. But we see him whom for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Now in this text, you see humiliation here. Here is God being made lower than the angels. He is being made the lowest of the humans as well. He is being crucified. He is being mocked. He is being laughed at. He is being scorned. And you see the humiliation that is happening. And so through human perception, you would look at this and say, failure. Jesus has failed. Jesus has not accomplished the mission of God. If he is the Son of God, how can you have man putting him up on a cross to kill him? But this is the power of the resurrection. The resurrection happens. He rises from the dead. And from the human perspective, this looked like a failure this entire time. But from God's perception, this was all God working behind the scenes to bring about the fruition and the salvation of mankind. What man would look at and call it failure, God says, I'm still telling your story, and I'm still creating a story in your life. What you may look at and say, this was a failure. I made a mistake. I cheated. I was caught. Maybe I went through family difficulties that didn't work out the way I expected my life to turn out. And you sit back and you think everybody's looking at you and say, well, you failed. You failed. That's not the way it was supposed to be. And God's saying, you don't know all the story yet. You don't know what I'm doing right now. You may think it was a failure, but I can take that and I can create a beautiful picture and a life through you. Human eyes, when we judge failure, are only saw through human eyes. Don't ever try to judge something without seeing the entirety of the story. Look at Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. How ironic this reversal is. In America, in our culture of success, in our culture of social media where you only put something on social media to highlight your successes, we have a God who says, I did it totally the other way. I am a God that used suffering to bring glory. And so a lot of times when we make these judgments on what is a failure and what is success, we're not really making true, accurate judgments, because God can take that failure and then bring glory to his name through you and through that failure. A lot of times we think failure is so final that we'll never recover from it. It's really not about the mistakes that you make. It's how you respond to those mistakes. It's what you do about those mistakes. That if you don't believe that God can redeem those mistakes, you're not having the faith in God and his infinite power to change lives and to bring about healing, to bring about glory, to bring about salvation and redemption and forgiveness. The forgiveness of God and the plan of God is so mysterious and powerful that if you can believe and move on in your faith, that God can work through you. Don't let your failures to be final. Don't let your mistakes to be something that defines you and then you give up on your faith. Allow God to continue to work in your life. Rebuke this narrative of success in America that keeps constantly telling you if you don't do it absolutely perfect, you're not good enough. When there's those failures, trust, and hope in God that God can still weave a beautiful story through you. You see this picture, and this depicts something that happened in 1569, and the character here is very famous in the anti-Baptist tradition. Now, the Anti-Baptist tradition is very much influential in the Restoration movement. In the Churches of Christ, we get a lot of our thoughts and concepts from this movement called the Anti-Baptists. Now, the Anti-Baptists believed in something very radical. They believed in baptism of adults. Now, at this time in 1569, if you rejected your child being baptized as an infant, you were a heretic. They believed in believers' immersion. And so this Dirk Williams, he was fighting against some of this theology that you were to baptize your babies, and he believed that baptism was for somebody who believed, that knew what they were doing. But the church at that time considered him a heretic, and so they captured him and they took him in the Netherlands and they put him in prison. But Dirk was very intelligent, and he took some of the rags and he tied them and he tied them and tied them, and he created a rope and he escaped from the prison. And he lowered himself down, but there was a moat there, and it was frozen over. And so he was crossing over the moat. But then one of the guards saw him. Now, Dirk, because he was in prison for so long, was very thin and famished, and so he was light. And so he was running across the ice, and he made it. But the guard was chasing him, and he ate his food probably. And he fell through the ice. Now, Dirk escaped. But the guard started crying, "Oh, help me, help me." And he turned around and he went back and he saved this man. But in the process of saving him, the rest of the guards captured him again, put him back into prison, and ultimately the church at that time burned him at a stake. And they said he cried out before he died 77 times, "Lord, they know not what they do." We don't hear much about Dirk Williams, but for years, this man inspired a movement of grace, of kindness, of love, of doing good to those who persecute you. The world may have looked at this and said, "Dirk, that's a failure. You're trying to escape prison. You're already away. It's not his fault or your fault that he fell through the ice. You should have kept on going." And from the worldly perspective, that would have seemed like a failure choice. But God, using this man and him turning around and saving this life, inspired others to be sacrificial in their faith. And he modeled forgiveness and love. God made him more into the image of Jesus Christ. Because a lot of times when we think of failure, we don't realize that failure is part of our sanctification process as well. Failure is part of our story as well. And God can use failure to make you more like Jesus Christ. You have an opportunity to respond to the gospel this morning if you will believe, confess, repent, be baptized for the remission of your sins, and rise up out of that water to newness of life. Or maybe you need prayers. Maybe you need the congregation to pray for you. Because failure is really a beginning point. It's a beginning point. And so no matter what you have done, you can start over today again. And why don't you do so as we stand and sing the invitation song.
I once was lost in sin, but